Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new webinar in the cities organized by ANEMEL. ANEMEL is a project funded by the European Innovation Council working on making clean hydrogen from dirty waters, as we like to say. We've been running this webinar series for a while now, and it's a true pleasure to have our speaker today, who's Stephanie Metzger, who's a science policy and communication expert. She uses both her expertise in communication and policy to study the intersection in economic growth, in sustainability, in technological change in society, and she works at the Royal Society of Chemistry to build links between academia, policymakers, and the broader world to develop new applications and new approaches to sustainable development. So she was also one of the authors of the YouGov report, one of the first surveys in the UK about PFAS. I'm sure like all of you have heard about PFAS before. I'm gonna hear a lot about them today. So I'm not gonna have an introduction about these forever chemicals. I'm sure we're gonna hear too much about this type of substances now. So with that, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Stephanie. The floor is yours. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Sorry, I've just realized that I had the date wrong on my presentation and I spelled my name wrong. So I promise the rest of the presentation will go more smoothly uh, going from here, getting the technical issues out of the way. Yeah, thank you so much to the ANEMEL team for having me on today. I do a lot of work on PFAS at the Royal Society of Chemistry. I have been for a few years. And so I'm very keen to talk about it today. I could talk for probably 3 hours about PFAS, but I have promised to keep it to around 20 minutes today so we have time for some questions. So we'll jump right into it and talk about, start with actually what are PFAS and why do we care about this issue? So PFAS are a group of chemical substances. Now, this slide looks very chaotic and smushed smushed with information, and I promise that the rest of the PowerPoint will not be like that. But I purposely put all this information on this slide just to illustrate sort of how much information and complexity there is about PFAS. Um, so the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, defined PFAS in 2021 after with an expert working group who worked for a few years to do this, and basically they presented a very broad definition that PFAS are defined as fluorinated substances that contain at least one fully fluorinated methyl or methylene carbon atom. Um, and this definition um, is wider than definitions that had been proposed in the past. But it's basically sticks to the main fact that all PFAS have a backbone of carbon atoms with fluorine bonded to them. And fluorine and carbon make an extremely strong bond. It's one of the strongest bonds that exist. Sometimes I say it's one of the strongest bonds that, that found in nature, but in fact, PFAS aren't really found in nature. Most like PFAS are man-made synthetic chemicals, but the carbon fluorine bond can be occasionally found in nature, and it's an extremely strong bond. Um, and that means that it provides a lot of really positive um, qualities, like they're very durable materials because that bond is so strong. They also provide resistance to heat, slipperiness, waterproofness, oil resistance, things like that. So there's extremely positive and useful qualities that come out of this durability and strength of this carbon fluorine bond. But at the same time, uh, that strength of that bond means that if PFAS get into the environment, for example, or into our bodies, they don't break down. And that's why often they've been called forever chemicals because they stick around for a very long time once they're created. So, this little graphic on the slide shows some examples of some PFAS that were already considered PFAS under previous definitions. For example, PFOS, that's one of the common ones that people will hear about. Um, and PTFE, which is better known as Teflon. And then there's in the green box on the right, some examples of PFAS that were added when the OECD definition came out. So how's that expanded? And at the bottom, there's some substances that are not PFAS. So for example, trifluoromethane is not considered a PFAS. So I'm not going to linger on this slide because I assume my slides will be sent out or be available afterwards for people to look at. So please feel free to go back and look on your own time. But I think the whole point of this slide being so dense was just to show how complex this issue is, even at the beginning when we're just talking about what is a PFAS. So why are we concerned? Which PFAS are we worried about? Why did this become an issue? So I'll say on the next slide a little bit more, but there are a few PFAS that we have discovered over time that have some negative effects for human health and the environment. So, for example, PFOS or PFOS, PFOA or PFOA are two of the oldest PFAS, and they have been shown to have health effects. And they have been restricted now, actually, under the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, which is an international treaty that most countries are signed up for, and that basically, when a substance is restricted under this convention, all countries that have signed up are legally obligated to follow those rules and to phase out the use of that substance. So there's another one on there, PFHXS, which was added, I believe, in 2022. And then there's another group as well called long chain PFCAs, perfluorocarboxylic acids, which were added as well to the Stockholm Convention actually just last month. PFOA has also been designated as a carcinogen by the WHO. And another common PFAS is called Gen X, the more chemical acronym for it is HFPODA. And that one has also been shown to be very toxic at low levels. So Gen X, for example, is a chemical that has not been restricted in its use. It was actually a chemical that was brought in to replace PFOA when we found out that that one was harmful. But then we found out that that was a bit of a regrettable substitution, meaning that it actually turned out to also be harmful, just in a different way than the original one was. So why are we so concerned about these? Well, there are a number of effects of some of these PFAS that I put on the screen before on human health. So, for example, they can cause things like high cholesterol, liver and kidney damage, and potentially cancer. They can cause developmental defects and fertility issues. And then this is just in humans. These these chemicals also have harms on wildlife and the environment. So this is why we have started to take a look at PFAS over the last maybe 10 years or so, but in the last 5 years especially. And while a few of these are banned again or heavily restricted under this Stockholm Convention, as I just mentioned, there are some other ones that also still have negative effects that are not regulated very heavily. So there's been increasing concern that we need to do something about PFAS. But of course, how do they get into the environment in the first place? There are a number of areas where we are likely to see PFAS contamination. For example, airports, military sites, and fire training areas, or anywhere else where there's been major fires, because firefighting foams, sometimes, if you've heard the technical term, is called AFFFs, aqueous film forming foams. They use PFAS to basically create a film over top of the fire and smother the fire. And they're super effective, but also when you spray a firefighting foam, you can't really recover it after you spray it. So it goes out into the environment, and you can't clean it back up essentially. So it goes into waterways, it washes down into rivers, and may contaminate, for example, our drinking water supplies. Industrial facilities that produce or use PFAS have also been seen to emit PFAS in their wastewater. Wastewater treatment plants are another area where PFAS have been found. Wastewater treatment plants historically have been designed to deal with biological contaminants and not really chemical contaminants. And so we often find that chemicals like PFAS that might be in wastewater go into the plant and come right back out the other side because they're not really addressed. Landfill sites are another area where PFAS can accumulate. In trash that we throw away. But landfill sites, especially older landfills, often were not very well contained or lined. And so you can have landfill leachate, so leakage essentially coming out of the landfill into the environment in the surrounding area. And finally, waste incinerators are a final place where we might see contamination because PFAS are, again, very heat resistant. And they are actually so heat resistant that they don't really break down until the temperature is over 1,000 degrees Celsius. And many waste incinerators, especially at the local or municipal level, are burning waste at a lot lower level, a lot lower temperature than that. And so it's possible that um, PFAS are then um, coming out of the waste stream of the incinerator, so like the smokestack. So we've talked about sort of why PFAS are something that we might be concerned about. So now we need to take a look at what European countries are doing about it. So there's a few examples here. I've just made this overarching slide to start, just to show some different regulatory approaches happening in different areas. And I've included the US on this list as well, just for some comparison. So in the EU, the major action against PFAS at the moment is a restriction proposal on all PFAS, according to that OECD definition. And they're taking a precautionary approach, which basically means that a lack of scientific certainty about the effects of chemicals or the effects of a substance or about the hazards that might come from it should not stop us from taking regulatory action if we think there is a risk of really highly damaging or irreversible harm. And the European authorities have decided that PFAS fall into this category, and so they are proposing to restrict the use of all PFAS. In the UK, there is a little bit more of a targeted approach going on so far. They're still developing their thinking on this, but they have moved forward at least with a restriction on PFAS in firefighting foams. So as I mentioned before, that's the main area where we know PFAS, and particularly hazardous PFAS, are used. And they, again, is you can't really clean it up. So it's a very obvious way to stop pollution from getting into the environment if they can restrict the use of PFAS in firefighting foams. And they're looking at some other restrictions potentially in the future. But there's also quite a push to see if industry could be voluntarily incentivized to switch to alternatives potentially. In the US, again, just for some comparison, I won't be going into detail here, but they're using their chemicals regulation, so the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is TSCA, that acronym, first acronym, and then the second acronym stands for Significant New Use Rules, which basically means if you want to use PFAS in a new context, they are taking a stricter approach to allowing that. So they're trying to restrict new uses of PFAS and some of the, again, more toxic ones. They also have a really excellent analytical testing program in the US for PFAS, although I am not sure the status of that under the new administration, unfortunately. And finally, there's a lot of litigation going on in the US against companies, especially that have produced PFAS in the past. And the money that has been won from these cases, in many cases, has been used to contribute toward cleanup of PFAS and research into new alternatives and again to remediation technologies. So on to the EU. The EU restriction is basically going to fully ban, essentially heavily restrict the use of all PFAS. This proposal was submitted by a number of EU member states in 2023, and there was a consultation in 2024, which had a lot of responses of information from all stakeholders. And so the current timeline is on the screen here. This is farther. This is pushback from what they originally were looking at. So they were originally thinking they would be able to have this restriction finalized in 2025, but in fact, it's taken a lot longer for the European Chemical Agency committees to go through all the information and evaluate the proposal and how it would affect different industries and different uses of PFAS. And so, in fact, now they're looking at 2026, 2027 as a time for the final proposal to go to the European Commission for approval. So it probably won't be actually in force until 2027 or 2028 at this point. But basically, this would heavily restrict the use of PFAS in all cases for all PFAS, except for any derogations, is the word that they use, basically any exceptions that they deem necessary. And this would be in a case where PFAS is an essential product for some, or an essential component of a product or a process that can't be replaced or that's really critical for society. So, for example, there are some PFAS used in pharmaceuticals, but this is an area where it's deemed very necessary and very beneficial, where the benefits outweigh the harms. So, that's an area where they would allow an exception to continue to use PFAS. There is a big question in this restriction proposal about whether polymeric PFAS and particularly fluoropolymers like PTFE, so like Teflon, should be included in this restriction because materials like Teflon are very useful in a lot of high tech applications. For example, hydrogen electrolyzers. Um, and this is a conflict where we see that the technology that we need to achieve certain goals, for example, the EU Green Deal and the EU decarbonization targets, might be in conflict potentially with other things like this PFAS ban, because if it removed materials like PTFE from the market, it might be very difficult to replace them, or very expensive, uh, or things like hydrogen electrolyzers might not be as effective as they would be if these materials were used. So that creates a bit of a question and a conflict. So there's a lot of push from industry to say that we should not include fluoropolymers in this restriction because they're really, really important. However, there's also a lot of concerns that fluoropolymers do still have negative effects. While fluoropolymers themselves are very stable and are not bioavailable, the process to make them historically has been a major source of PFAS contamination. Again, for example, with these some of these extra bad ones that we know about, like PFOA and Gen X chemicals. And also the end of life, the waste stage of fluoropolymers can also be a way that PFAS can enter the environment. And so while they are very important and perhaps they are not as hazardous, they're not harmful when they're in their fluoropolymer form, there are still questions about harms that may emerge in other parts of the life cycle of fluoropolymer production and end of life that we need to address in order to make sure that this is used responsibly. There's also been some action in some individual EU member states. For example, in Denmark, there's been a restriction on PFAS use in food packaging and consumer clothing and textiles, coming into force next year and 2030, I believe. And then in France, there's also been a ban on PFAS in consumer products, notably except for cookware, because Tefal is a major French company that makes Teflon cookware, and they were able to lobby for an exemption. So that's an interesting show of where politics interacts with the science in this area. The French law also has an excellent polluter pays principle embedded, where companies that emit PFAS in their effluent from their factories, for example, will now have to pay pay an amount per the amount of PFAS they emit, and that money will be specifically earmarked towards cleaning up PFAS and funding improvements in remediation, for example, in drinking water facilities. In the UK, we've got a slightly different approach, as I mentioned. So I'm located in the UK. So we are doing this restriction on firefighting foams here. I say we, I mean the UK government. So DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and also for the Health and Safety Executive. They are also looking potentially at other restrictions in the future on consumer products and dispersive uses of PFAS, but those probably won't be started until a year or two from now. And there was also a recommendation in what is this called, this RMOA, this risk management options analysis, that there needs to be more cross governmental coordination on this issue, for example, with other areas like drinking water and environmental standards. If anyone is interested in what's going on in the UK at the moment, there's actually a link on this slide to a committee hearing tomorrow happening in Parliament in the Environmental Audit Committee, where they're currently doing an inquiry into PFAS and they'll be hearing oral evidence. So just another fun thing to watch. Well, fun if you're me, to watch tomorrow if you're interested in learning more about what's happening in the UK. The other important thing to note about what DEFRA has been doing is they recently released a position on persistent, mobile, and toxic substances and very persistent and very mobile substances. And this is a way of categorizing chemical substances that the EU has also recently adopted. So this new position from DEFRA brings them more in line with the EU. And this basically says that if a substance is persistent, mobile, and toxic, or very persistent and very mobile, it should be considered for regulatory action. And this is similar to other categories that are already established, for example, substances that are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. Um, this approach has been released in the context of their thinking on managing PFAS, but it's also a useful concept for other potential chemicals or potential contaminants uh, that they may need to regulate later. So it's a good development in regulatory thinking in the UK. There were a few areas for further research that they identified as well, which I think is important to know, just for the scientific community to say where we can contribute to further research in this area or further thinking in this area. So, for example, they said they need more methods developed to define the mobility of a substance. They need screening tools to aid prioritization of hazardous substances and different exposure scenarios. And they also need better monitoring programs to target this new category of substances, this persistent and mobile substances. I always say you can't manage what you don't know, and so this monitoring and measurement of these substances in the environment is extremely important to help to characterize and understand how to manage this issue. Um, this is just a brief slide. I'm going to skip over this in a second because I'm running out of time here. But it's just important to say that the US EPA, like I said, is doing a good job with some toxicological testing, which I'd be happy to talk about more if anyone has questions. But I want to briefly, before we finish, have a bit of a chat about what the Royal Society of Chemistry is doing on PFAS and some of our policy asks, because it's one thing to define this issue and say all the problems and the questions that need to be answered, but we want to also try to propose some solutions. So we have had a campaign on PFAS in drinking water, which we have tried to encourage the UK government to put stricter standards on the amount of PFAS that can be present in our drinking water in the UK to put us in line with other nations. So, for example, the EU. Um, and we had a campaign where we both released a position statement, an evidence report, and also a public sort of campaign of people writing to their MPs. And actually, this had a really good outcome with an update at the beginning of 2025, where water companies will now have to enforce a limit of 100 nanograms per liter for 48 different PFAS, the cumulative total. This actually brings us not only in line with, but actually more strict than the EU standard, which is a collective total of 100 nanograms per liter for 20 different types of PFAS. So this was a really great outcome. That is what we were asking for. And it means that going forward, the UK should have more strict protections for our drinking water. And while drinking water is not the only way that we can be exposed to PFAS, it is the most universal way because we all have to drink water to survive. Food is another route of exposure, but obviously people have varied diets, and it's a lot. We're still working on characterizing where PFAS are in the food supply chain. But drinking water is one area that everybody will benefit from a stricter standard. We also have a policy ask for stronger wastewater treatment. Again, as I mentioned, wastewater treatment plants are not really designed to deal with chemical contaminants. And the UK has actually fallen behind the EU at the moment in our wastewater treatment directive. So the EU has actually updated their wastewater treatment directive recently, just starting effective in 2025, which has not only added a requirement for more treatment in wastewater treatment plants to deal with some of these chemical contaminants such as PFAS and microplastics, but also has again introduced this polluter pays principle where industries responsible for a lot of this pollution are going to have to cover up to 80% of the costs of installing this new treatment in wastewater treatment plants to again make sure that the people who are responsible or the companies, the industries that are responsible for this pollution are paying to make sure that it is cleaned up when it is in the environment, and that we as everyday consumers or everyday citizens are not being forced to clean up after potentially bad practices happening at the industrial level, especially in the past. The final thing we've been looking at a lot recently in the RSC is about PFAS alternatives. So we had a workshop in February to talk about alternatives to PFAS. This slide, again, for looking at later, is just a few where we talked about this the different types of options for PFAS alternatives and how you might go through the process of, if you're a company, for example, assessing where you might be using PFAS and what alternatives might be available to you and how you could go about substituting. On this slide, again for later, there are some links to not only the slides from this workshop, but actually a YouTube playlist with all of the presentations from that workshop. So if this is an area you're interested in, you can go through and see some more information about the topics that were discussed there, either on the slides or actually watching the presentations themselves. So yeah, that's everything that we've been working on at the RSC, and in general, a brief overview of PFAS. If you're interested more in our work, you can always email our policy team at policy@rsc.org, or myself, and my email is on there. I work on chemicals regulation in general, including PFAS. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Steph, for a wonderful presentation. It's been really interesting to learn more about what's happening around PFAS in regulations, and then very like the last part, looking into wastewater and what PFAS do there, how we can get rid of them. Because I mean, obviously, the goal of the project is trying to make hydrogen from wastewater, seawater, and impure source of water.
Yes.
So we've been looking at getting rid of PFAS within the electrolyzer, within the device, but maybe we should be looking at how to get rid of PFAS, or at least not make it worse if we are treating wastewater to make the green hydrogen. So
Yeah.
that's a very good point. Um, thanks again for the presentation. I wanted to thank the RSC again for supporting this webinar and for all the slides and all the materials you've put together around PFAS. I want to remind everybody who's connected that they can ask questions using the chat on YouTube, and I'll be reading them if any. But of course, I've got some questions of my own as well that I'd like to maybe discuss a little bit if we've got the time. So I kind of have a question that's a little bit of a moral dilemma, because obviously after so many years of using PFAS everywhere, we sort of gotten used to them. It's the same with
Yeah.
plastics, it's the same with a bunch of other materials. Um, but then they have become really key and really sort of unique for some applications. How do we substitute that in applications where it's very difficult or almost impossible to find an alternative to the characteristics in resistance and the characteristics in versatility that PFAS could give us?
Yeah, so I think there's two points to be made there. One is that there are some applications, like you said, where PFAS are really critical, and there isn't really an equivalent material. Um, in those cases, I think there's a lot of maybe scary talk in the EU at the moment about the restriction proposal, that it will ban all PFAS and no one will ever be able to use any PFAS anymore. But in fact, there are going to be these derogations or these exceptions that are made for areas where the use of PFAS is crucial and where it's demonstrated that there is no viable alternative at the moment. I think that they will be expecting people to try to innovate alternatives, but it's definitely recognized that in some areas that just doesn't exist at the moment. And so there will be a transition time or an exception entirely for those areas. But I think you made exactly a good comment there about the versatility of PFAS. There are some cases where we need a material that can be at all times heat resistant, waterproof, slippery, durable. You need all of those properties in one. And in that case, PFAS is really useful because it provides all of those properties in one material. But in many cases, in many applications, PFAS has been used because we know it's a good material and and it provides these, it's really reliable, but it is not necessarily used for all those properties at once. So sometimes you might use a PFAS because it's heat resistant, but you might not need all the other properties. Or you might need something that's waterproof, but you might not need the heat resistance or the durability, right? So um, the the challenge with substituting PFAS is that we're going to have to be a lot more specific and targeted in the way that we look for alternatives than we could have been with this sort of universally useful material. Um, there's not going to be a one size fits all replacement for PTFE, for example, for Teflon. We're going to have to evaluate every use and say, okay, in this case, I'm using PTFE because it's heat resistant. So I need another heat resistant material. In this other case, I'm using it because it's slippery. For example, maybe non-stick pans. So I need something that is slippery. Um, and so you have to tailor your alternative to each of those applications. So it is going to take work. It's not going to be easy or, as easy as just saying, oh, here's my other new sort of silver bullet material. We can replace everything at once. You're going to have to go through, if you're a company, for example, you're going to have to go through and assess. I use this PFAS here for this reason and this one here for this reason. And I might need two different materials to substitute for what I previously used one material for. But there are a lot of materials out there that are useful for those different applications where you're looking for a specific property. Without having like a more specific example, it's hard to maybe say more. But I think that's the important thing is the methodology that we have to go through is that you're going to have to use more than one material to
Mhm.
substitute for PFAS.
Yeah, I mean, even without the example, I think it's a perfect quote in general about like how we've been using it because they're there. Again, obviously the
Yeah,
polymers, so there's a lot in common with plastics in general, but it's the same with plastics. We've been using them because they've been there, and maybe they're not ideal for supermarket bags, but they're ideal to make phone cases or whatever like
yeah,
you want to use. So it's
exactly.
maybe you need to look at the properties and the recyclability and safe and sustainable by design properties instead of just
Yes,
looking at, oh, this is fantastic for my frying pan. Why is it fantastic for your frying pan? Is it because of the non-slippery properties? Is it because of heat resistant? Is it a
exactly.
combination of both? So it's
Right.
a very good point. I mean, talking
And
about pans, I
yeah,
was thinking because you mentioned that the EU and I'm assuming the rest of regulators are going to come up with exceptions to the rules.
yeah,
And obviously, you already mentioned the example of Tefal in France
yeah,
lobbying against certain regulations in in restrictions for PFAS in that application. I've seen similar things in a topic that sort of affects ANEMEL, because
uh-huh,
in some cases, for some devices, I think it was batteries,
yeah,
there's no restrictions. It may be CRMs, not PFAS, but it's the same thing. If the lobby is big enough, the restrictions get lifted for certain things, but not for others. And in
yeah,
this case, electrolyzers may actually not need a restriction on PFAS if the PFAS never touches anything that's pollutable.
yeah,
But why do we keep ban for everything without looking at every application? That's also a complicated issue. How
yeah.
do you see the regulators navigating this lobbying landscape in the future?
Yeah, so I think this is the reason pretty much that the proposal has taken a lot longer to process than they originally expected. So they submitted the proposal. So it was a group of countries, member states that brought the proposal forward. Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden. I think there are 5 countries. I can't remember every single one, but probably not surprising which ones they are. But so and they were expecting to have it sort of ready to go and approved and starting to be implemented by 2025. But the amount of responses that they got to their consultation that they did last year asking for information on uses of PFAS and all these sort of things was so much that actually they've had to revise their process, both to have time to fully examine all of the evidence, but also to look more closely at different sectors. So the process that they went for, as I sort of put up in the one slide, um, is that there's these two committees in ECHA that are like a technical committee and a socioeconomic committee, and they have been meeting over the last like last year and through this year and potentially even into next year to evaluate different sectors and different applications of PFAS to see where um, to dig into more where PFAS are used and why, what types of alternatives are available, what the sort of availability from a technical perspective, but also from a sort of, economic perspective. Are they being produced? Are they affordable? Right. Um, and trying to more nail down in each sector, like where there are opportunities to move away from PFAS and where maybe those challenges do exist more, or where where they might want to make exceptions again for these sort of critical uses, right? Like pharmaceuticals could be one.
Mhm.
So that process is taking longer than I expected, but I think it's positive because taking that approach of looking a lot more into every industry, I think it's good because it both is showing where there are possibilities to move away, to make sure that we hold industries accountable that maybe claim that they need PFAS when they really don't, but also it is showing these areas that it really is critical and maybe we think that there's a benefit that we'd want to keep it around. And to
Mhm.
me, that's where other regulatory tools also come into play. So you mentioned in electrolyzers, for example, they're not going to be released to the environment, right? But still, the PFAS that go into those electrolyzers has to be produced, and so we need to take a
And
look at how
disposed
they're
at
being
some point.
produced,
So
right? And at the end of the life of the electrolyzer, they have to be disposed. And so it's an area where we might say, okay, maybe we still want to allow the use of the PFAS. They're very important and they're very controlled in their use. So we know that they're not really being emitted during the use of the electrolyzer. But then we need to use other tools. For example, looking at the manufacturer, making sure that's safe, perhaps making sure environmental permitting is strict to say that companies that are manufacturing the inputs, the raw materials, aren't emitting to the environment, which in the past has happened. And then at the end of life, is there a way to dispose of this? Are we
mhm.
going to recycle the materials in the electrolyzer? Or does the PFAS that is in there contaminate those materials that makes them unrecoverable or unrecyclable? And is there a
Mhm.
way to design the product that makes it at the end of the life that makes us able to remove the useful parts of the product that we want to recycle and reuse and maybe be able to handle the PFAS that might be hazardous in an appropriate way. So that's where
Mhm.
that's why considering the use of PFAS throughout the life cycle is so important because it captures maybe some of those um, areas where risks might appear, not just in the thing we think of in the first place. Oh, it's so good for my product or so good for my use. But is there a broader, in the broader life cycle of the product or of the material? We need to
Mhm.
capture those risks and then use those other regulatory tools to make sure we're controlling them appropriately. And ideally, that
Mhm.
means that we can use the PFAS that we want, or this goes for any material, right, or any chemical or substance. Hopefully, using those appropriate controls across the life cycle mean that we can use that material or that chemical to get those benefits that we need. And also in a way, though, that is responsible and is protective of people and the environment.
Mhm. So I sort of want to change audience a little bit because we've talked a lot about policymakers, and I'm assuming when you said the consultation about PFAS got a bunch of unexpected responses, and a lot of responses, those were from experts in the field of PFAS. But have you noticed a trend in the raise of awareness among the general public about this issue? Because I mean, obviously, we had the blockbuster movie Dark Waters talking about the issue,
Yeah.
and that was like quite a hit. But then I don't know if people are starting to demand, fewer things made out of PFAS, or maybe they go buy up, some cookware and they know about PFAS and they demand something without the
Yeah.
technology. And also, I know I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here because I'm a chemist and I'm super biased in this regard. But are we creating too much fear for the risk that PFAS actually create, like in a similar way to BPA and some plastics, because it never gets released but still creates a bunch of worries. So like, I think my question is like, how about the public awareness around
Yeah.
PFAS? Has it grown? And then also, um, do we have a reason for that actual worry? And should we take care of that from the regulatory level to avoid
Yeah.
further contamination in the future?
Yeah, I think there's a few things here. First of all, in general, I think there is a lot more awareness, even just in the past year or two, of this issue. Even just in my own day-to-day life, like when I started working on this issue a few years ago, I would say, "Oh yeah, I work on this thing called PFAS," and people would just look at me with blank stares. And now, occasionally, I run into a friend at the pub. I say I'm working on PFAS, and they go, "Oh, I think I saw something in the news about that," or "I saw some product that I bought that advertised it PFAS free." So yeah, I do think there is more awareness from the general public, and also, like you said, a move as well, especially in the consumer products area, that this might be a sort of a marketing tool, like the BPA thing was, where companies would say, "Oh, this water bottle is BPA free," right? Regardless of what that means. Or I've seen as well some things that say like, "Oh, we're PFAS free," but they never contained PFAS in the first place, so it's like a marketing tool.
I mean, in
Uh,
that sense, we could go to like gluten-free and
yeah,
lactose-free and things like that. Like the
right.
other day, I saw mayonnaise that was lactose-free, and it's like, who puts milk in my? Anyway, so
Right,
yeah, I
right,
know
it wasn't in the
sometimes it's
first
just a
place.
marketing thing.
Exactly, exactly. So there's that sort of marketing aspect as well. I think in terms of like concern and is this the right level of concern? I do think there is. I do think it's valid that people are worried. The thing with PFAS and some of the other sort of newer chemical contaminants or pollutants that we're dealing with now in society is that the problem is that it takes a while for the effects to manifest. So those on the slide earlier that I talked about the potential hazards, those harms come from continued low level exposure to PFAS over a long time. But it might take 20, 30, 40, 50 years for those problems to manifest. Um, and the other thing with health issues in general is it's often really hard to pin down what exactly the reason you encountered a health issue is, right? So no one's going to have PFAS as like their cause of death on their death certificate. But their cause of death might be cancer. And was the cancer affected by the fact that they had a high level of PFAS in their body? That's something we're trying to determine. And in some cases, so for one of a few of these most studied PFAS, they have been able to show that link. But I think the important thing is basically if we get to the point where all of these health effects start to manifest, it's too late to do anything about it. So it is important for us, again, that goes back to that precautionary approach to say, where there is this irreversible harm that might happen, where it's too late once we realize it's happened, we need to be precautionary. We need to be taking a cautious approach up front to making sure that we're not accidentally exposing ourselves to things that cause harm later that we can't do anything about. That said, I do think that the public is actually quite good at understanding things better than sometimes we might give them credit for. So we did, as you mentioned at the beginning, we did a study. The RSC did a study with YouGov earlier this year about public attitudes to PFAS in the UK. And we did a representative survey of over 4,000 adults in the UK across all four nations in the UK, demographics, political affiliations, all of that. And they they people did want alternatives. They did say that, they wanted PFAS to be more controlled and they wanted alternatives. And they did say they even wanted PFAS where we think they're lower toxicity or maybe lower risk. They said they still think there should be appropriate controls on them. They said we don't have to ban them outright, but we do think there should just be appropriate controls. But the interesting thing is we had some focus groups after this, and we split these focus groups up by people's sort of level of self-reported level of risk acceptance. So people had a lower tolerance of risk and maybe a higher tolerance of risk. And with that, we found still that both groups were in the focus group where we got to talk a little bit more in depth with them. They were all very aware of the nuances and actually spoke themselves with a lot of nuance about this topic, saying, for example, that they did want to have alternatives available. They wanted to be able to, um, you know, make informed purchasing decisions, but also that they wanted to make sure it was scientifically evidence backed that they were making those decisions and it wasn't just someone scaremongering. And also as well that they recognized, for example, that while it's important to not expose ourselves to harmful substances, there's also sometimes important uses, and also they didn't want people to be disadvantaged. For example, if PFAS were banned and certain products went off the market because they contained PFAS, and that affected primarily lower socioeconomic groups. They were very concerned that, with cost of living and all of these issues at the moment, that that could have disproportionate impacts. So they were actually speaking about this in a very nuanced way, understanding those different aspects of things. So I think the public can engage with it, in that more higher level, that more nuanced level. And I think that as well, though, the it's an interesting question because obviously the public is a lot more aware of these sort of things in consumer products, consumer uses, whereas a lot of the issues from industry, for example, are focused more on technical materials and products that they sell maybe to other businesses or machinery or something like hydrogen electrolyzers or energy technology. Mostly consumers are not using those themselves. Batteries, yes, but like other, you don't have your own hydrogen electrolyzer at your house, right? So it's there, that is a question as well. And you can see, for example, in the French and Dutch laws that have come through already, those are focused on consumer products. New Zealand also did a ban on PFAS in cosmetics, for example. I think it's a lot easier. A lot of consumer products are a lot more of a low hanging fruit for reducing the amount of PFAS that we use, because a lot of consumer products don't have that high technical specification that require something like a PFAS that something like a hydrogen electrolyzer or a
Yeah.
pharmaceutical does. Um,
And I'm assuming that also at the same time, those consumer products don't have maybe like the same disposal requirements yet, at least, than maybe an industrial electrolyzer would have. Because if you have industrial machinery, you're gonna probably properly dispose of it, following the regulations, because you cannot just throw benzene to a river. You cannot just
right,
dispose of giant electrolyzer in a
exactly.
dumpster. But you can have a, I don't know, some cream, hand cream or something, and then just wash your hands, and without realizing it, just be polluting way more than the electrolyzer is doing in a
That's
industrial
exactly
setting.
it,
So yeah,
exactly. So, like, cosmetics are a great example where, you wear your makeup or you wear your hand cream or whatever, you wash it down the drain at the end of the day, and then it automatically goes into the and we just talked about how, right, wastewater treatment plants aren't really very good at dealing with these sort of contaminants, whereas, like, medical waste, for example, medical, uses for PFAS are really important. So, for
that's
example,
heavily controlled and
right,
recycled
but
and
it's
taken
heavily
care of.
controlled
So mhm,
or incinerated at an extremely high temperature because of, safety
mhm,
requirement. That means that those PFAS are going to be dealt with. So yeah, there's
yeah,
a lot. You're right. A lot stricter controls often on those industrial uses as well. Whereas
yeah.
a consumer use of cosmetics or like a cleaning product or something in our house is going to be a lot different than, yeah, an industrial use of those things.
Yeah, again, I see so much in common with like microplastics and pollutants of that sort. With again, because the use of them has grown so much,
Yeah,
and it's just extended to absolutely everything. It's very hard to get rid of them,
yeah,
and at the same time, it's very hard to control where they've ended up in, because it's so much.
yeah.
Um, uh, I'm very glad we had this conversation. I really hate to cut you here, but we've been here for a while, and I don't want to bore people too much about talking about PFAS.
Yeah, I could
It's
talk
been
about this all
fantastic.
day, but I
I
know
mean,
not everyone's there with
and
me.
you found someone who's actually interested in PFAS and chemistry and regulation. So that's yeah, we could be here for hours.
Yeah.
I don't want to close without mentioning again and showing to everybody who's connected or may watch this later all of the resources that the RSC has on PFAS. Again, because you came to give the talk and the RSC supported this, which has helped a lot with reach.
Mhm.
There's a ton of materials for policy advocacy to materials for the general public. If you go to the RSC webpage, I'm showing it on the screen right now, but it really takes no time to find. I just Google RSC PFAS and I got directed here. Got videos, infographics, and a bunch of
Mhm.
answers to key questions on the life cycle of PFAS. Reports, what to do if you want to speak to your representatives. There's a lot of very useful information. And then again, just to talk a little bit about the project, also want to bring up materials on PFAS. Love your slide on the different types of PFAS, of course, but we have our own little infographic that we produce with
It's really
compound
nice. Yeah.
interest, which is based on the different types of PFAS, what they are, where you find them, and this goes alongside an article on our webpage called Fluorinated Forever Chemicals and Where to Find Them, which sort of gives you a little bit of background, again, for the general public on what PFAS are, where you can find them, and what we're doing in ANEMEL to get rid of them in electrolyzers, but then also in the chemical industry. But yeah, again, so feel free to check out rsc.org, anemel.eu. I wanted to thank you again, Steph, for a wonderful presentation, a very, very nice debate afterwards. And Yeah, I think for I think we could probably close the webinar now. I want to thank the RSC again for supporting this, and of course I want to thank Horizon Europe program and the European Innovation Council for providing the funds that support ANEMEL. If you need more information about the project, please go to our webpage, anemel.eu, subscribe to our newsletter, and the webinar will remain on our YouTube channel if you want to check it out. And I think Steph mentioned that the slides are available. I don't want to offer them without your
Yeah,
permission, but
yeah,
I guess you shared your email. So
absolutely.
if anybody has any questions or wants to talk about the slides, yeah,
Yeah, happy to
they're
share.
open as well. But yeah, so thank you again, Steph. Thanks everybody for joining, and yeah, feel free to stay in touch with ANEMEL and the RSC through our social media, web pages, and newsletters, all the social channels available. Thanks for joining again, and see you in the next edition.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye.